Hi there, welcome back. We are now in the stage 5, which is the final stage of design thinking. In this stage, we are going to discuss how do we test a prototype and how do we scale it. That means we're looking at implementation, iteration, and scaling up of the prototype. Let us say you built a prototype through a mind map or a dynamic prototyping mechanism, and now you have started actioning it real time. How much time should you actually give to a prototype to action? Design thinking, primarily, whenever I teach design thinking, I tell them 45 days is what you're looking at when you're implementing a prototype. Go ahead, take that entire design that you've created and then fearlessly implement it and be very clear. You will experience certain failures and therefore you keep reviewing the way it is working and you keep iterating it. There's no problem. There's no problem at all if you tweak your prototype. Nothing is going wrong there. So let's say you identified the measurables. Now, how do you define the measurables when you're implementing a prototype? The measurables have to be designed in 4 parts, and we've spoken those 4 components, 4 parameters in the past. The first parameter that we're talking about is the execution parameter. Now, what is an execution parameter? How do you measure whether you have the capabilities available in the organization? Tick it with yes and no. Because capabilities a lot of times are very qualitative in nature. Yes and no is fine. If it is yes, fair enough, the component is working. If it is no, then restrict yourself in terms of the prototype and see how it can be implemented. But I think the critical component of testing your prototype is your stakeholders' measurement criteria. What decides that the prototype is successful? Therefore, go with the prototype, talk to your stakeholders and ask them 5 to 7 criteria, measurement criteria, which will help you to control your prototype. If those criteria are being met, your prototype is successful. If those priorities are not being met, your prototype is not successful. So when you're implementing, take the prototype, discuss it with your key stakeholders, ask them how would they measure the success of the prototype. Don't put your measurements into it. At the best, help them to decide on the measurements. Shortlist 5 to 7 measurements and then start implementing the prototype. When you implement the prototype and you find that the measurement is actually working, that means the prototype is becoming successful, normally it happens under 45 days. That's when the iteration stops and now you start scaling the prototype. So scaling a prototype is where users can finally experience and react to your ideas real time. That means at the end of the 45th day, the prototype is tested, validated, found to be reliable, and you got measurements built into it. This step is helpful for refining your prototype, learning more about your users, and identifying whether or not the point of view of the problem statement was accurate. I have never in my journey, if people have spent good enough time in terms of identifying the objective statement, the outcome statement clearly, the business outcome statement clearly, they don't have to change the business outcome statement. And ideally, you should not change the business outcome statement. If you are changing your objective statement or business outcome statement, that means your design thinking process at the first step itself was flawed. How do you build a prototype? Like for instance, we talked about various tools. So rapid concept development is one of those where you have a proof of concept. So rapid concept deployment assists us in generating an hypothesis about the potential new business opportunities. Normally, this hypothesis is good for business model. In the first stage, the design criteria, the custom personas, and all the pain points are taken into account and the new ideas are generated. Those ideas in the second stage are assembled into a mind map or a prototype, and this proof of concept actually becomes your prototype. And by the way, in the design thinking process, whatever we do rapidly. So then anything that you do will come under a rapid concept development for sure. And that's rapid prototype building. A mind map as a tool is a rapid prototype building tool. Iteration in terms of a low fidelity sketch also is a rapid prototype. You can also do your assumption testing. When you're building your mind map and when you're building your prototype, at that point in time, you smash your assumptions and decide we're not going to do it the way we did it in the past. So assumption testing focuses on identifying assumptions underlying the attractiveness of the business idea. That means you're using available data with the likelihood that these assumptions will turn out to be true. And a lot of times in quick hanging solutions that you look at, you'll take a lot of ideas that you assume are right. There is no problem. But in the second stage of the prototype, you can go beyond it and smash assumptions. No problems at all. If your prototype is not working, that means certain ideas that you assumed are the ones that are not working. You can either eliminate those ideas or you can value add to those ideas. The assumptions are then tested through thought experiments followed by field experiments. That means you can actually think through within your team, and then you go out into the field when you're now putting the prototype real time and you test it out there. Identify what would it take to get the data quickly, then design your thought experiment, paying special attention to the data that could prove that you're wrong. Then don't worry. A lot of times when you have taken ideas which are past assumptions, your prototype will not work, and that's where you smash the assumption of those ideas, bring in the shortlisted ideas which you thought were quick wins, but you've not brought them in. You may want to look at the empathy map, the journey map, and then you might want to shift certain ideas which you had advanced in the stages and bring them, prepone those ideas. Maybe they work for you. So the two design thinking tools that we talked about, one was building a rapid concept or the proof of concept that we talk about, and the second is if it is not working, that means there are certain assumptions that you've made which are underlying the prototype, which are no longer holding true, and you may just want to ruthlessly eliminate those ideas and bring in an idea, even if that idea feels to be risky. But remember one thing, if you think that the idea is risky, mitigate it. And obviously the prototype is now being measured under the 4 parameters, and those 4 parameters are your execution capabilities. You're looking at the parameter which is the stakeholders liking it, which is defensibility. You're looking at the parameter of scalability, and you're looking at the parameter of is it generating the requisite profits that you thought. Now, if this prototype and when this prototype works, rapidly scale it across the organization. So if I go back to Atessa Online, when we tested it on the 4 components and when it worked beautifully for us, what we did was we instantly scaled it up through the internet across the world. Do not hesitate, and that is the power of design thinking. The scalability of the prototype is the power of design thinking. So you make a prototype based on the problem statement, convert it into an opportunity statement, ideation happening, quick wins identified, validating the quick wins, building them into a prototype, actioning the prototype, measuring it. That is your learning launch. In the learning launch, you're testing whether your prototype is working. And once you know it's worked, rapidly scale it up across the organization and then move into the phase 2. That means now you're starting a new design thinking project, and that design thinking project will sit on top of the existing prototype, and therefore you're creating a new value addition in your organization. You're done. This is your design thinking model. So a lot of times when Darden University talks about it, they say what is primarily a stage where you're identifying the problem and converting it into an opportunity statement. What if is your detailing ideas. What works is your prototype, but before you decide on what works, they also talk about a situation which is what wows. And what wows are those quick wins which are validated wins. So what is your problem statement. What if are your ideas. What wows are certain ideas which are quick wins which will work, and they're wow ideas. You know that they're going to work. And finally, what works, which is your prototype. So you'll find a lot of different models that have got created on design thinking. You can create your own model on design thinking, no problem at all. And go ahead and action it. As long as it fundamentally maps to the scenario where you are using the steps of design thinking and you're able to build a prototype and test it and scale it up in the organization, you've done fine on design thinking. Use whichever tool, create your own tools. I love one thing about design thinking. It is so flexible and adaptable. It just does not restrict you to any constraints. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the concluding session.